My name is George, and I'm 85 years old. For most of my life, I was the kind of man who couldn't sit still. I built my own house, worked the garden with my bare hands, chased after my children when they were little, and later carried my grandkids on my shoulders as if they weighed nothing more than feathers. But a few years ago, everything changed. It started with a dull ache in my knees, the sort of pain I thought would pass with a good night's rest. It didn't. Day by day, it grew sharper, deeper, until even walking across the living room felt like climbing a mountain. I'll never forget the morning I realized just how bad it had become. I swung my legs out of bed, placed my feet on the floor, and before I could stand, my knees screamed in protest. The sound wasn't loud, of course, but inside my head it was deafening. A burning, grinding pain that made my breath catch. My body had betrayed me. I remember gripping the nightstand, trying to pull myself up. My wife, Margaret, still asleep beside me, didn't see the tears forming in my eyes. Tears of frustration, not weakness. Tears of fear. Because in that moment I thought, what if this is it? What if I'll never walk without pain again? The simplest things became battles. Tying my shoes, carrying groceries from the car, climbing the front porch steps I had built with my own hands decades earlier. Each task turned into a reminder of what I had lost. And the worst part wasn't the pain itself, it was the shame. I hated asking my daughter to help me stand when we went to church. I hated telling my grandson I couldn't play catch in the yard. The disappointment in their eyes stung more than the ache in my joints. Maybe you know that feeling too. That quiet humiliation when your body stops cooperating. When you have to say no to things you once loved. Do your knees protest when you rise from a chair? Does your back throb after just a short walk? Do you sometimes wonder if your world is slowly shrinking day by day? That was my reality. And let me tell you, it eats away at your spirit. I started avoiding social gatherings. I made excuses to skip outings with friends. I convinced myself it was easier to stay home. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was disappearing. Margaret would look at me sometimes with that soft, worried gaze only a spouse can give. She didn't need to say anything. I could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of losing the man she married, not to illness, but to hopelessness. Nights were the hardest. Lying awake, shifting from side to side, searching for a position that didn't hurt. The house would be silent, and all I could hear was the throb of my joints, like a cruel drumbeat reminding me of my limits. I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder, is this the beginning of the end? And yet, even in my darkest moments, something inside me whispered, hold on. Maybe you felt that too, that faint flicker of hope that refuses to die, no matter how heavy the weight of your pain. One afternoon, sitting alone on the porch, I watched the breeze stir the leaves in my backyard. I thought about all the seasons I had witnessed there, the laughter of my children playing hide and seek, the Sunday barbecues, the quiet evenings with Margaret sipping iced tea, and I realized I didn't want those memories to be all I had left. I wanted more. I didn't know it then, but the answer I was looking for was right there in that very backyard. A simple leaf, overlooked for years, would change everything. But before I tell you about that, I need to ask, and you? Do you live with pain that keeps you from doing the things you love? Do you ever wonder if it's too late to feel like yourself again? Because if you've asked those questions, then you'll understand my journey. And maybe, just maybe, my story can be yours too. The pain didn't arrive all at once. No, it crept in slowly, like an uninvited guest who makes himself at home before you realize he's not leaving. At first, it was just stiffness in the mornings. I would shuffle to the bathroom, blaming it on old age, telling myself I just needed to stretch a little. But the stiffness turned into aches, and the aches into sharp jolts that stopped me mid-step. One Saturday, I remember walking to the corner store. It was only 3 blocks away, a path I had walked 1,000 times. But halfway there, my knees locked up. I froze on the sidewalk, clutching the handle of my cane, pretending to admire a neighbor's flowers just so no one would see the grimace on my face. By the time I made it home, I was drenched in sweat. Not from the summer heat, but from the effort of forcing one foot in front of the other. The truth hit me that day. I couldn't trust my own legs anymore. Little by little, the pain started stealing pieces of my life. I stopped mowing the lawn because the vibration of the mower sent shocks up my knees. I stopped going fishing because climbing into the boat felt impossible. Even walking to the mailbox became a calculated risk. But the cruelest theft was my freedom. I had always been proud of my independence. I was the man who fixed the leaky faucet, who carried Margaret's grocery bags, who shoveled the driveway after a snowstorm. Now I found myself sitting on the porch watching neighbors do the things I used to do. And every time someone asked, "George, do you need a hand?" it felt like a knife twisting in my pride. The impact reached beyond me. My grandkids, full of energy and laughter, used to beg me to play catch in the yard or race them down the driveway. I'll never forget the look on little Emma's face when I told her, "Grandpa can't today." Her smile faltered and she said, "That's okay." But I could see the disappointment. Children don't know how to hide it. And then there was Margaret. She tried to be patient, to act like nothing had changed, but I noticed the way she hovered when I stood up, ready to catch me if I stumbled. I saw her eyes flicker with worry every time I winced in pain. I hated that look. It wasn't pity, it was fear. Fear of losing me piece by piece, not to death, but to disability. Maybe you've been there too. Maybe you know what it's like to watch the people you love tiptoe around you, as if your pain is a fragile glass they're afraid to shatter. Maybe you've felt the sting of sitting on the sidelines while life goes on without you. I began to retreat. Invitations to dinner with friends. I made excuses. Church gatherings. I stayed home, claiming I was tired. In reality, I was ashamed of how slow I had become, ashamed of the groan that escaped my lips every time I stood, ashamed of the way pain had reduced me from participant to observer. One evening, my son came to visit. He suggested we take a walk down the street like we used to. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to relive those father-son walks, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. But the thought of making it only halfway and having to turn back, it crushed me. So I shook my head and said, "Maybe another time." He smiled politely, but I caught the flash of sadness in his eyes. And in that moment, I realized something. My pain wasn't just mine. It was spilling over, touching everyone around me. And that's when despair began to settle in. It wasn't just about my knees anymore. It was about losing my place in the world. I felt like a burden, a man waiting for his body to betray him completely. At night, when Margaret had fallen asleep, I would sit in the living room in the dark, listening to the tick of the clock. Each tick felt like time slipping away, each second another reminder that I was fading. Sometimes I whispered to myself, "Is this how it ends? With me watching life pass by through the window?" I wanted to scream, to fight back against the pain, but I didn't know how. Doctors had given me pills that dulled the ache but fogged my mind. Friends talked about surgeries, but at my age the risks felt greater than the hope. So I sat there night after night with pain in my body and despair in my heart. And maybe you've asked yourself the same question I did. Is this really my future? Because when pain grips your life, it doesn't just steal your strength, it steals your joy, your identity, your will. And I was on the edge of losing all three. There's a moment when pain stops being just a nuisance and becomes a wall between you and the life you used to know. I didn't see the wall at first, but one day I slammed right into it. It was a cold morning in February. I woke up before the sun, as I always did. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet you can almost hear. Margaret was still asleep, the soft rise and fall of her breathing steady and comforting. I swung my legs out of bed and set my feet on the floor, determined to stand without leaning on the nightstand. I told myself, today will be different. Today I'll walk like I used to. But when I pushed myself up, my knees buckled. A sharp, burning pain shot through my legs, so sudden and intense that I gasped. My body crumpled back onto the edge of the bed. I sat there, hunched over, hands trembling, sweat forming at my temples. My heart was pounding. Not from exertion, but from fear. Fear that my legs would never hold me again. And for the first time in my life, A thought crossed my mind that I had always pushed away. Is this the beginning of the end? Margaret stirred. George, are you all right? I forced a smile she couldn't see. Just a little stiff this morning, I lied. But inside, I was breaking. Later that day, I tried to do something simple. Put on my socks. Such a small thing, isn't it? But I couldn't bend far enough without my knees screaming. My fingers trembled as I tried to hook the edge of the sock. Finally, I just sat there defeated, staring at my bare feet. It sounds ridiculous, but at that moment, tears welled up. Tears not from pain, but from humiliation. 85 years old, and I couldn't even dress myself. That was my breaking point. It wasn't the long walks I missed, or the fishing trips, or the Sunday church pew. It was a sock. A simple, ordinary sock that became the symbol of everything I had lost. I remember whispering to myself, is this who I am now? A man who can't even put on his socks? The days after that blurred together. I moved through them like a ghost, my world shrinking to the size of our living room. The TV played, but I didn't watch. The phone rang, but I didn't answer. Friends called to invite me out, and I let their messages pile up unheard. Margaret tried to keep my spirits up. She cooked my favorite meals, set out my slippers near the bed, patted my hand when she passed. But I could see the sadness in her eyes growing heavier each day. It wasn't just me suffering anymore. It was her too. One afternoon, my grandson came over. He bounded into the house full of energy, clutching a baseball glove. "Grandpa, let's play catch," he said, eyes shining. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to push myself up and walk outside, glove in hand, like the man I used to be. But the thought of stepping onto that uneven lawn with my unsteady legs filled me with dread. "I can't today," I told him softly. His smile faltered. "That's okay," he said. But I could see his disappointment. He dropped the glove by the door and went to watch TV instead. When the door closed behind him later, I sat in my chair staring at the empty space he'd left. My heart ached more than my knees. Pain was robbing me of memories I could never get back. That night after Margaret had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The house was dark, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Tick, 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 each one a reminder of time slipping away. I stared at my hands, knotted and veined from decades of work. These hands had built furniture, cradled babies, fixed cars, planted gardens. And now, they just lay there, motionless, on my lap. A thought drifted through my mind, quiet but sharp. Maybe this is it. Maybe I've reached the end of the road. I won't lie to you. There was a heaviness in my chest that night that felt like despair. I wondered if I was destined to spend the rest of my days sitting in that chair, waiting for the world to move on without me. And yet, in the deepest part of me, a tiny ember of defiance still glowed. I didn't know what I could do, but something inside whispered, "This can't be the end. Not yet." Maybe you felt that too, that fragile moment when you're so close to giving up, but some quiet voice inside you won't let you. That was me, sitting in the dark, wondering if my life as I knew it was over, but holding on, barely, to the hope that it wasn't. I didn't know it then, but something was about to shift. Something so simple, so ordinary, that it would have seemed laughable if I hadn't been desperate enough to try. Sometimes, hope shows up in the quietest ways, not as a headline or a miracle, but as a simple moment, almost invisible at first. That's how it happened for me. It was a soft spring afternoon, the kind of day where the air smells faintly of earth and fresh grass after the morning rain. I was sitting on the back porch, a blanket over my knees, staring out at the yard I could no longer tend. My garden had always been my pride. Rows of tomatoes, basil in clay pots, a patch of mint by the fence. I knew every inch of that soil, every leaf and stem. But now the weeds had begun creeping in, little green invaders I couldn't kneel down to pull. Margaret was inside on the phone, and I sat there listening to the birds. My body ached, but my mind was restless. I thought about all the years I had spent out here, my hands in the dirt, my back strong and steady. and I whispered to myself, "Will I ever feel that alive again?" Just then, I heard the gate creak. It was Clara, my neighbor for over 20 years. A widow in her 70s, spry as a squirrel, always tending her own garden. She walked up carrying a small basket of cut herbs. "Well, George," she said, her eyes scanning the overgrown beds, "I thought you could use a little green." She handed me the basket, thyme, rosemary, and a few sprigs of something else I didn't recognize. I smiled weakly. "Thank you, Clara. You're keeping me from living on frozen dinners." She sat down on the porch step, tucking her skirt under her knees. "You're looking thin, George. Not moving around as much?" I hesitated, then shrugged. "Can't do much these days. Knees are shot. Some mornings I can barely stand." Clara tilted her head. "Have you tried the leaf?" "The leaf?" I laughed. "What leaf?" She reached into her basket and pulled out a small bundle of dark green leaves tied with twine. They were smooth and slightly glossy with a sharp, clean scent, somewhere between eucalyptus and mint. "It grows right in your yard," she said, pointing to the far corner where a cluster of the same plant swayed in the breeze. "Most people think it's just another weed. My grandmother used it for her joints." I blinked. "For her joints? Clara, I've been living here for 30 years. You're telling me the answer's been right under my nose?" She chuckled. "Not a cure, George. Don't go thinking it's magic, but it helps. I've been making a tea out of it for years, keeps my knees from swelling up like balloons." I picked up one of the leaves and held it between my fingers. It felt sturdy but supple, its scent clearing my head. "What's it called?" She told me the name, an old-fashioned folk name I had never heard. "Boil a few leaves in water, drink it warm, or crush them and use them as a compress. Simple as that." I raised an eyebrow. "And you're sure it's safe?" Clara nodded. "It's a plant, George. People have been using it for generations. Look it up if you like. There are even some studies now. But the main thing is, it's gentle. It gives your body a little help." I stared at the plant in my hand, torn between skepticism and desperation. A leaf? Could something so ordinary really make a difference where pills and creams had failed? Clara must have seen the doubt on my face. "You've tried everything else," she said softly. "What's the harm in trying this?" Her words sank in. She was right. I had tried prescription medications, over-the-counter painkillers, even those expensive supplements from late-night TV. Nothing had given me back my life. And now, here was a leaf from my own backyard, offered not by a doctor in a white coat but by a neighbor with soil under her nails. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Curiosity. A small, tentative hope. "All right," I said at last, tucking the leaves into my palm. "Show me how to make that tea." Clara smiled. "That's the spirit. Start slow, 1 cup a day, and give it time." She stood, brushed the dirt from her hands, and walked back toward the gate. "You'll let me know how you feel," she called over her shoulder. I sat there a long while after she left, the bundle of leaves resting in my lap. The scent rose up, sharp and clean, and I felt a strange sense of possibility. Not certainty, not a promise, but possibility. I looked out over the yard, the same yard that had once been my kingdom and had now become a wilderness, and for the first time in months, I imagined myself moving in it again. Not just sitting and watching, but walking, bending, tending, living. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, I boiled a pot of water and dropped in the leaves. The steam filled the kitchen with that crisp, green scent. I poured it into a mug, cradling it in my hands like something fragile. I didn't expect a miracle. I didn't even expect relief. But as I took that first sip, warm and earthy on my tongue, I thought, maybe this is my first step back. The first cup of tea didn't work a miracle. And honestly, I didn't expect it to. The bitterness on my tongue, the warmth sliding down my throat. It felt comforting, yes. But comfort is not the same as healing. That night, I went to bed without expecting anything. My knees still ached and I still groaned when I rolled onto my side. But somewhere in me, a seed had been planted. A thought. What if this helps? Even just a little. The next morning, I made another cup. Margaret raised an eyebrow as she watched me drop the leaves into boiling water. "What's that?" she asked. "Clara gave it to me," I said. "Says it's good for the joints." She looked at me for a long moment, then simply nodded. "Well, it smells better than those pills you take." I smiled. For once, there was no argument, no skepticism, just quiet support. The days turned into weeks and the routine became a rhythm. Every morning I boiled water, dropped in the leaves, and let the steam fill the kitchen. Some mornings Margaret joined me. We sat at the table with our mugs, the house still quiet, the day not yet rushing in. It felt almost sacred, like we were reclaiming a small piece of life together. The first real change was subtle. One morning I realized I had walked to the porch without bracing myself on the wall. It was just a few steps, but for me it was a victory. I stood there, the sunlight warming my face, and thought, something is different. A few days later I noticed another shift. I was able to bend just enough to pull on my socks without feeling like my knees were on fire. I froze in place after doing it, hardly believing it had happened. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. Margaret noticed too. One evening, as I carried my empty plate to the sink, she looked at me with surprise. "George," she said softly, "you didn't ask me to help you stand." I hadn't even realized it, but the pride in her voice was unmistakable, and it stirred something in me, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't done yet. The family began to notice the changes before I even admitted them to myself. At Sunday dinner, my daughter watched me push back my chair and stand without groaning. "Dad," she said, her eyes wide, "you look steadier. What's going on?" I shrugged, trying to play it down. "Just a little tea Clara told me about." She frowned, almost suspicious. "Tea? That's it?" "Just tea," I said. But inside, I felt a spark of pride. Then came the afternoon with my grandson. He bounded into the house, glove in hand, the same way he always did. "Grandpa, want to play catch?" I hesitated. The old dread rose in my chest, the fear of disappointing him again. But then I remembered the porch steps I had climbed that morning without pain. "All right," I said. His face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. We walked outside together, and for the first time in months, I stood on the grass, glove in hand. My throws weren't strong, my stance wasn't perfect, but we played. The sound of the ball smacking into his glove felt like music. When we came back inside, my knees ached, but it was a different kind of ache, not the ache of defeat, but the ache of use, the ache of life. Each day brought small, almost invisible victories. I could walk a little farther before needing to rest. I could stand at the sink long enough to wash the dishes. I even started pulling a few weeds from the garden, kneeling carefully with a cushion Margaret laid out for me. One evening as I sat on the porch, Margaret leaned against the railing, watching me sip my tea. "You're different," she said softly. "How so?" I asked. "You're smiling again." Her words struck me. I hadn't noticed it myself, but she was right. Somewhere between the bitter taste of those leaves and the rhythm of my mornings, hope had returned. Not in a rush, not like a storm, but gently, like the slow return of spring after a hard winter. Now let me be clear. It wasn't magic. My pain didn't vanish overnight. There were still days when my knees protested, when the stiffness held on stubbornly. But the difference was undeniable. I was moving again, I was trying again. And that was enough to change everything. Maybe you know that feeling too. That moment when the fog begins to lift. When you realize the pain no longer controls every corner of your life. Maybe you've had that small taste of freedom, enough to make you believe more is possible. That's where I was. Just a few weeks in, holding on to the fragile thread of progress, but already feeling like a new man. One leaf, one cup at a time, I was walking my way back, and deep down I began to wonder, what if there's more to this than I ever imagined? For weeks I drank the tea without asking too many questions. All I cared about was how I felt, the small victories that began stacking up like quiet miracles. But eventually curiosity got the better of me. One evening after Margaret went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of old notebooks and my grandson's laptop. I typed in the name Clara had told me, the name of the leaf I'd been boiling every morning. The screen filled with articles. Some were blogs, old herbal guides, even recipes passed down through generations. But then, to my surprise, I found studies. Real studies. From universities I recognized, Harvard, Stanford, even the NIH. I leaned closer, adjusting my glasses, my heart thumping as I read. The words were full of long, complicated phrases. Flavonoids, antioxidant properties, anti-inflammatory compounds. Words I hadn't heard since high school biology. But as I dug deeper, I began to piece it together in a way I could understand. This little leaf I'd overlooked for decades was packed with natural compounds that fight inflammation. Inflammation? That was the enemy in my joints. It wasn't just old age making my knees ache. It was tiny fires burning inside the tissue, swelling and grinding away at the cartilage. Doctors call it arthritis. I just called it misery. And here, in front of me, study after study confirmed that plants like this one could calm those fires. Not cure them, not erase them overnight, but soothe them, naturally, gently, consistently. I stumbled across an article from a Japanese university that caught my eye. It explained that the leaf contained something called anthocyanins, pigments that give certain plants their deep color. These pigments, the scientists said, protect the body from oxidative stress. Oxidative stress, another big word. But as I read, I realized it was simple. Our bodies rust, just like an old fence left out in the rain. Over time, oxygen creates damage in our cells, breaking them down faster than they can repair. But plants with these special compounds act like tiny shields, slowing that rust, protecting our cells from aging too quickly. I sat back in my chair, letting it sink in. This wasn't magic. This wasn't superstition. This was nature doing what it had always done, offering quiet remedies hidden in plain sight. The next day, I told Margaret about what I'd found. "Listen to this," I said, reading aloud from one of the articles. Researchers at Harvard found that people who regularly consumed plants rich in flavonoids reported lower levels of joint pain and stiffness. She looked at me, her eyes wide. "So Clara's leaf? It's real?" I nodded. "It's not a cure, but it helps, and the science backs it up." Margaret smiled, her face softening. "You know, George, maybe God put that plant in our yard for a reason." Her words stayed with me. Maybe she was right. Maybe all these years while I was chasing after pills and doctors and complicated treatments, the answer was growing just a few feet away from my porch. Over the next week, I kept reading. I learned about how these compounds support circulation, how they help muscles recover, how they keep cells healthier longer. One article from the CDC even suggested that diets rich in these kinds of natural antioxidants were linked to lower rates of memory decline. Memory. Now that struck me, because pain wasn't the only shadow that had been creeping into my life. There were days I forgot names, misplaced keys, lost my train of thought mid-sentence. I used to brush it off as senior moments, but deep down, I worried it was more. And here was this leaf, not only helping my knees, but possibly protecting my mind too. I wasn't naive. I knew it wasn't a miracle drug. I knew it wouldn't turn back the clock or make me 30 again. But the science gave me something priceless, validation, proof that what I was feeling wasn't just in my head. One evening, I sat with my grandson at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd first searched for answers. He was scrolling on his phone while I sipped my tea. "Grandpa," he said suddenly, "you've been walking better lately. What's your secret?" I smiled. "A leaf." He laughed. "A leaf? Come on." "It's true," I said. "Science says it's full of these things called flavonoids. They calm the inflammation, makes it easier to move." He looked at me skeptically. So you're telling me a plant is better than all those medicines? Not better, I corrected gently, but different, kinder. It works with me, not against me. He shrugged. If it's working, that's all that matters. And he was right. For all the big words and studies and charts, the truth was simple. I was walking again. I was playing catch again. I was living again. Maybe you're skeptical the way I was. Maybe you're thinking, how can a leaf make a difference where doctors struggle? I understand. I asked the same question. But here's what I learned. Nature has been healing us longer than science has been studying us. And sometimes the simplest things, those we overlook the most, carry the greatest power. So when I sip my tea in the morning, it isn't just about easing the pain. It's about trusting that the world around us is filled with quiet helpers, waiting for us to notice them. And every time I take that sip, I think, this is science, this is nature, this is hope. Change, I've learned, doesn't come in great leaps. It comes in whispers, tiny shifts, barely noticeable at first, until one day you look back and realize you've built a whole new life out of small choices. That's what happened to me. The tea became the anchor of my mornings. Each day began the same way. I'd shuffle into the kitchen, fill the kettle, and watch the steam rise as the water boiled. Dropping those leaves into the pot became almost ceremonial. The sharp green scent filled the air, waking my senses before the sun fully rose. Margaret often joined me. Sometimes she brought her crossword puzzle to the table. Sometimes she just sat with her hands wrapped around her mug. We didn't always talk. We didn't need to. The ritual itself was enough. A shared pause, a moment of peace before the world stirred. But the tea was just the beginning. The changes crept in, one by one. First, I started walking a little farther each day. At first, it was just down to the mailbox and back, then to the corner, then a slow loop around the block. My cane was still in hand, but it felt less like a crutch and more like a companion. Neighbors noticed. "Looking good, George," they'd call out as I passed. Their encouragement gave me fuel. It wasn't about pride. It was about belonging again. Next came the garden. For months, I had sat on the porch watching weeds creep across the soil where tomatoes once grew. One afternoon, I told Margaret, "I think I'll try to pull a few." She looked at me skeptically, but handed me an old cushion to kneel on. I lowered myself down carefully, half expecting my knees to scream in protest. But to my surprise, the pain was manageable. My hands sank into the soil, and the smell of earth filled my lungs. I hadn't realized how much I missed that. The feel of dirt under my fingernails, the rhythm of pulling, planting, tending. When I stood again, a little stiff but triumphant, Margaret clapped softly from the porch. "You're back," she said, smiling. Her words meant more than she knew. As the weeks went on, I began to notice other small shifts. I slept more soundly, without tossing and turning to escape the ache. My appetite improved. I craved fresh food again, not just the comfort of bread and soup. Even my mind felt sharper. I could follow conversations without losing my place, remember names more easily, and find the right words when I needed them. It wasn't just the leaf. I know that now. It was everything together: the tea, the walking, the gardening, the lighter meals, the better sleep. Each small choice stacked on the last, building a rhythm I hadn't had in years. One morning, my daughter stopped by unannounced. She caught me outside, hose in hand, watering the basil and rosemary. "Dad," she exclaimed, You're working in the garden?" I grinned. "Just a little. Don't tell the weeds I'm back." She laughed, but then her eyes grew shiny. "You look more like yourself." And in that moment, I realized what all of this really meant. It wasn't just about walking or bending or standing longer. It was about identity. I was reclaiming the pieces of me that pain had stolen. Of course, there were still bad days. Days when the weather turned damp and my joints stiffened. Days when I overdid it in the garden and paid for it with a night of aching. But even then, something had changed. I no longer felt trapped. I no longer believed the pain had the final word. Instead, I saw it for what it was. A companion I could live with, not an enemy that ruled me. And that shift in mindset was as powerful as the leaf itself. Margaret noticed the change most of all. "You're lighter," she told me one evening as we sat on the porch. "Not just in your step, in your spirit." I thought about that. She was right. Pain had weighed down not just my body but my whole outlook. It had closed doors, silenced laughter, dimmed my world. And now, day by day, that weight was lifting. One Sunday after church, I shared my story with a friend who had been struggling with his own joint pain. He listened quietly, then asked, "So what's your secret?" I smiled. "It's no secret. Just a leaf, some patience, and a few small changes." He looked doubtful, the same way I had when Clara first handed me that bundle. But then I saw the flicker in his eyes, that spark of hope. And that's when it struck me. My journey wasn't just for me. If I could climb out of that pit of despair, maybe others could too. Maybe all it took was one small choice, one tiny leaf, to turn the tide. Maybe you know what that's like. The feeling that you're trapped in habits you didn't choose, that your body has taken charge of your life. But let me tell you, it doesn't have to stay that way. You don't need a miracle. You just need a rhythm, a set of small choices that together create something bigger than the pain. And for me, that rhythm began with a leaf in my backyard. Months passed, seasons shifted. The first tender green of spring gave way to the heat of summer, then the crisp air of autumn. And through it all, the tea remained my steady companion. By now, the leaf wasn't just a remedy. It was a ritual, a reminder, a lifeline. Every morning, without fail, I brewed it, inhaling its sharp, earthy scent as though it were the very breath of hope itself. And little by little, those small victories grew into something much bigger. The first sign came one Sunday morning. Margaret and I were getting ready for church, a routine that had become more struggle than blessing. Usually she had to help me down the porch steps, her arm firm around my waist. But that morning, as she reached for me, I waved her off gently. "I think I've got this," I said, her brows knitted in concern. "George?" But I stepped forward, slowly, carefully, and descended each step on my own. When my shoes hit the driveway, I turned back and smiled. Her hand was still half raised, her eyes wide with surprise. Then her lips curved into a smile I hadn't seen in months, relief mixed with pride. In that moment, I felt like a man reborn. The improvements didn't stop there. I began walking longer distances, first around the block, then through the park. The crunch of gravel beneath my shoes, the rustle of leaves overhead. It was like hearing the world's music again after months of silence. One afternoon, I walked past a bench where a group of old friends were playing checkers. They looked up, surprised. "George, haven't seen you out in a while." "Figured it was time," I said, lowering myself onto the bench without wincing. We played for hours, the banter easy, the laughter flowing. I realized then how much I'd missed it, not just the movement of my body, but the connection of being with people, of belonging again. But the greatest reward came from my family. One Saturday, my grandson bounded into the yard, glove in hand. "Grandpa, ready for another game of catch?" This time there was no hesitation. I stood, walked out onto the grass, and raised my glove high. We threw that ball back and forth until the sun dipped low and the fireflies began to glow. My knees ached, yes, but it was the ache of use, the ache of living. At one point he stopped, ball clutched in his hand, and said, "Grandpa, you're fast again." I laughed, shaking my head. "Not fast, buddy, just free." His grin was all the reward I needed. Even Margaret seemed lighter. She no longer hovered when I rose from a chair, no longer sighed when I groaned in pain. Instead, she teased me about spending too much time in the garden, dirt smudged on my jeans and under my nails. "You're 85, George," she said one evening, watching me water the basil. "Most men your age are slowing down." I winked at her. "Maybe I'm just getting started again." She laughed, and in that sound, I heard the echo of our younger years, the joy we thought time had stolen but was now quietly returning. And then one day, something remarkable happened. I was walking through the park when I passed a group of young people jogging. For a moment I watched them, their strides long and easy, their laughter floating through the air. I felt a pang of longing, but then I realized something. I wasn't jealous. I was grateful. Grateful that while I might never jog again, I could walk without fear. Grateful that I could bend, stretch, play, laugh. Grateful that pain no longer defined me. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the future. I won't pretend everything is perfect. Some mornings, the stiffness is still there. Some days, the ache reminds me of my age. But it no longer feels like a sentence. It feels like a reminder that I am alive, that I am still moving, still fighting, still here. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped low, Margaret reached over and took my hand. Her grip was warm, steady. "You know what I see when I look at you?" she asked softly. "What's that?" "I see the man I married, not because the pain is gone, but because you came back to yourself." Her words brought a lump to my throat. I thought about the months I had spent sinking into despair, shrinking into silence. And now, here I was, holding her hand, with hope alive in my chest. Maybe you've been where I was. Maybe you've sat in that chair, staring at your hands, wondering if life as you knew it was over. If so, let me tell you, it's not. It may take time, it may take patience, but it's never too late to find your rhythm again. Because if a simple leaf could give me back my life, imagine what might be waiting for you. Today, I don't fear growing old. I welcome it, because I know that as long as there are small choices to make, small victories to claim, life will always hold more to give. And that, my friend, is freedom. Looking back now, I realize the hardest part of my journey wasn't the pain itself. It was the fear that my life was over. The fear that I had already lived my best days, and that nothing but decline was left ahead of me. But here's the truth I've learned. Pain doesn't have to be the end of your story. Sometimes healing doesn't come in a bottle or a prescription pad. Sometimes it grows quietly in your backyard, waiting for you to notice. I never would have believed that a single leaf could give me back my freedom. Yet here I am, walking, gardening, playing catch, laughing again. Not because I found a miracle, but because I found hope. Hope in something simple, natural, and real. And now, I want to turn to you. Do your knees ache when you get out of bed in the morning? Do your joints stiffen when you try to climb the stairs? Or when you sit too long at the dinner table? Do you sometimes wonder if life is slowly slipping away, one painful step at a time? If so, please hear me. You're not alone, and it's not too late. I don't know what your leaf will be. Maybe it's this very one I discovered in my backyard. Maybe it's a change in diet, a walk around the block, a cup of tea shared with someone you love. But I know this. You have more life in you than your pain would have you believe. Don't give up. Don't surrender to despair. Your story isn't finished yet. So let me ask you, have you ever tried a natural remedy that surprised you? Do you feel your joints holding you back from the life you want? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear it, because when we share our struggles, we share our strength too. And if this journey of mine touched you, if it sparked even the smallest flicker of hope, I ask you to share it with someone you love. Someone who might be sitting in that same dark place I once was, wondering if life has passed them by. Sometimes all it takes is a simple reminder. Healing is possible, even in the smallest of ways. Today, at 85, I walk without fear. I walk without shame. Most of all, I walk without pain. And if I can, so can you.